All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Kaylee Meyer. I'm going to be your moderator for today's symposium. I want to welcome you all to SAJAC's third medical symposium. And before we begin, just tell you a little bit about myself. I have quite literally been grandfathered into the South African community here in San Diego. My grandparents moved here in the late 80s, and I've spent most of my life here, minus about 7 years where I lived in Israel and served in the Israeli army. Today, I work as an independent insurance broker, and I focus on helping seniors in the community with their Medicare and life insurance options. Now, for the real reason we're all here today, SAJAC, the South African Jewish American community, has been around in San Diego for 34 years. And during the pandemic, we saw interest from our community to provide them with the most recent medical information. We started with a very well-attended, successful genetics symposium in October of last year, and then followed up with an enlightening Alzheimer's symposium in March of this year. By popular demand, our focus is on cardiovascular risk reduction. I want to give a big thank you to Dr. Dennis Goodman, our keynote speaker, and to Pam Nathan, who have put hours into this symposium, making sure the agenda and the speakers and sponsors are all in place. And speaking of sponsors, the symposium has been made possible thanks to Jigsaw Health. Since 2005, Jigsaw Health has been developing the highest quality science-based nutritional supplements, including MAG SRT, America's #1 time-release magnesium supplement. In 2018, MAG SRT was evaluated in the Scottsdale Magnesium Study, a placebo-controlled human clinical trial of 91 participants, published in the peer-reviewed Journal of American College of Nutrition. We believe laughter is the best medicine. Magnesium is a close second. Jigsaw Health, it's fun to feel good. We have an extremely talented and well-educated panel who will be presenting the most up-to-date information in regards to cardiovascular risk reduction. After all of the speakers have presented, there will be a question and answer portion to address all of your questions. In order to have your questions answered, please be sure to write them in the Q&A box, not in the chat. Anything written in the chat will not be acknowledged. Another important thing to note is that this webinar is being recorded. If you cannot stay the entire time, you will get a copy later on. And we will be sending out a survey after the symposium. We really value your feedback, so please do take the time and let us know your thoughts, as well as what topics you would like to be covered in the future. Lastly, in order for you guys to best see the screen and the speakers, if you go to the top right of your Zoom screen, click on View, and then Full Screen, you will be able to see it across your entire computer. Now, without further ado, Dr. Dennis Goodman. Dr. Goodman is a professor of medicine and director of integrative medicine at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. He is board certified in cardiology, internal medicine, critical care, interventional cardiology, lipidology, cardiac CT, and integrative medicine. He graduated from UCT magna cum laude in 1979 and is an honorary professor at UCT. He has been visiting lecturer in many countries. He does clinical research and teaches at NYU. He is the founder of the NYU Prevention Lecture Series and a talk show host on Sirius Radio. He has been consistently named as one of New York's and US's top doctors. His passion is teaching and practicing preventative and integrative medicine, and he has published 3 books. Dr. Goodman, if you'd like to begin sharing your screen.
Thank you, Kaylee. So welcome, everybody. This is very exciting to do this conference. I was very excited when Pam asked me to help with this because I am really passionate about preventative. And I'm going to, in the next half an hour, 25 minutes, give you a feel for what it's about. And hopefully over the next 2 hours, we have a fantastic panel of speakers. You'll be able to learn something and you'll be able to take much of this information home to make yourself and put yourself on the right track to be happier and healthier. So that's my credentials. So this is a slide that really, for me, represents this chasm that we've got between complementary and allopathic medicine, this slide of the Grand Canyon. On the one side, we've got Western, allopathic, conventional, orthodox, and mainstream medicine. On the other side, we talk about complementary, alternative, Eastern, holistic, and integrative medicine. And I am a big believer that there's no such thing as alternative medicine. We should be working together so we can do the very best thing for patients. There's no question that when you have appendicitis, you want a surgeon and you don't want somebody to give you a vitamin. And so my belief is that we work together to give the patient the best option and so that they can get well and healthy. And I've spent most of my career trying to be a bridge between these two pathways. And it's not easy because you find yourself in one or the other. And when you try to do both, it's very easy to be in a situation where the other side says, well, you've sold out, you've given up. But in fact, I think you are offering the patients the very best in terms of what can be done if you understand both sides. And I'm all about that. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So integrative medicine, to me, is the best of both worlds. And this is a quote from Richard Smith, who was the editor of the British Medical Journal for many years until 2004. And he said, integrative medicine might restore the soul to medicine. He wrote a great article in the BMJ in February 2018 called How Medicine is Destroying Itself. And I can recommend that to you. And here really what he talks about is what I just said. We need to focus on both holistic and allopathic medicine to save basically medicine and to help people. So this is a poem from somebody called John Godfrey Sachs. Please look this up after this conference. It's called The Blind Men and the Elephant. I'm going to read you one verse or two verses from this poem, and here it goes. It was 6 men of Hindustan, to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, that each by observation might satisfy his mind. The first approached the elephant, and happening to fall against his broad and sturdy side, at once began to brawl. God bless me, but this elephant is very much like a wall. And this is what this poem is about. When you're blinded and you feel an elephant, whatever part of the elephant you're feeling, that's what you think it is. So this fellow here thinks it's a rope, and this one a wall, and this one a tree, and this one a snake, and this one a spear, and his ears, it's a fan. And I think we've reached a time in medicine, unfortunately, where this is very easy for this to happen. If you get sent to a specialist today, and we all know this, it's very easy if you land up getting sent to a gastroenterologist to land up with an endoscopy and a colonoscopy. That doesn't mean to say you don't need it, but that doctor is focusing on his subspecialty. And whenever you go see a specialist, you're going to find yourself getting testing and maybe even procedures from that subspecialty. And so I am very big on the fact that we need to have objectivity, and we need someone to look at the whole patient, the big picture. And it's not easy to do that because we live at a time where insurance companies, unfortunately, reimburse procedures and testing, and they're not that good on paying a doctor for sitting for an hour to talk to you about preventative medicine. And so I want you to know that it's up to you. You have to be proactive, and you have to be your own captain of your ship. And it's very, very important to try to find yourself a very good primary care physician or internist who's going to be your captain. But you really have to be a co-captain. So the impact of cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease is the #1 killer of men and women in the United States. There are over 750,000 people have a heart attack, or over 800,000 strokes a year. 2,000 Americans die every day, 1 every 40 seconds. Cardiovascular disease claims more lives than all forms of cancer combined. And here are the direct and indirect costs of over 320 billion. Nearly half of all Americans have some form of heart disease, and almost half the deaths due to sudden cardiac arrest are a person's first and last symptom of heart disease. In other words, it's a silent killer. But here's the good news. 80% of these events are preventable with lifestyle changes and attention to preventative measures. And that is why we're putting on this conference today. because I really believe that if you focus on these lifestyle changes, we can prevent and you can prevent heart attacks and strokes 4 out of 5 times. So what do I focus on every patient, no matter what they come to see me for, is what I call the integrative approach to cardiovascular disease, which is to think about nutrition and supplements, exercise and flexibility, sleep and stress management. And that's important for every single patient. Why? Because it's about being well. It's not just about going to the doctor to find out if you've got a disease or not. Wellness is not the absence of disease. Wellness is the art of finding balance in life. Just like juggling, everybody's got a lot of balls in the air, and you have to find time to focus on your health. So let's start off with the fact that a lot of people believe that if you've got genetic, if your genes are not good, then you're really in trouble. And we now know today that genes and your family history are a huge influence, but they're not your destiny. And I want to just point to a study that was published in 2016 in the New England Journal of Medicine by Amit Khera. And I just want to focus on this side of this slide. And you can see here the red bar. These are people on the x-axis who have a high genetic risk. They've done genetic testing. These people are at high risk for coronary artery disease, heart attacks, and strokes. And with lifestyle changes, just 4 lifestyle changes, there was a 50% reduction in these events. Now, what are these 4 lifestyle changes that they focused on? Don't smoke, don't be overweight, exercise, that means regular physical activity, and healthy nutrition. So just with those 4 lifestyle changes, there's a 50% risk. And what this tells you is that your genes are not your destiny. I've often said that your genes are like a loaded gun, but it's the you that pulls the trigger on that gun. And you can prevent something happening if that trigger never gets pulled. And the way you do that is to focus on a healthy lifestyle. So this is a book I want to recommend to you. If you're interested in genes and this whole topic of epigenetics, here is a very good book by Kenneth Pelletier, and you should read it. So this is nutrition, because I'm going to go into these 4 things. I'm going to leave this to our nutritionists on the panel here, but it's very clear now that with a healthy diet, you can reduce your cardiovascular risk. And I'm sure Melissa and Jackie will talk more about it. And this is just a slide showing you how the Mediterranean diet had a significant reduction in cardiovascular events. This is a wonderful slide of a 90-year-old lady who's still doing her yoga and exercising, and I'm going to leave the exercise part of this to my colleague, Dr. Neil Gordon. So what is atherosclerotic plaque development? And you can see here, when you're born, you have a normal healthy artery, no blockages, no plaques. Although I must tell you, they found plaques very early on in life in some people. They found it in soldiers. And what they're realizing is that plaques start really early on in life if you land up eating an unhealthy diet or you're unfortunate with a very bad family history. But you can see as time goes on, the plaque develops to a point that it becomes obstructive. But before it becomes obstructive, it can actually rupture. And you can get the contents of this plaque, which is basically like fatty material, cholesterol, can rupture, you see here, into the blood vessel. And the blood itself comes into contact with these contents and you get a blood clot. And that is how a heart attack occurs suddenly. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. You see an artery, the plaques are forming in the artery. This is the cholesterol buildup, the fatty buildup. And then you get this plaque rupture. And when the plaque ruptures, you can see on this artery here, there may only be an obstruction of 50, 30, 40%. But if it ruptures, you can get a thrombosis, a blood clot in an artery, and it can block the artery completely within a few seconds. So how does cardiovascular disease present? And I want to distinguish this for you today. When a blockage, and here you see one in the right lower panel, develops, and it gets to 70% or more, most people develop symptoms, and they develop chest pain or shortness of breath with exertion. And we call that angina or angina. And when you see a doctor and present with these symptoms, most of the time, the doctor will order or send you to a cardiologist who does a stress test. And the stress test will help diagnose whether or not there's a blockage, a coronary blockage of 70% or more. Now, what's most important to understand is that if you don't have a blockage of 70%, the stress test will be negative, or some people call it normal. The problem is, and this is a tragic story of someone that was beloved to all of us, Tim Russert from NBC, Meet the Press, in 2008, he had a sudden cardiac arrest and he was unable to be resuscitated and he died. So what happened to Tim Russert, who was asymptomatic, like half the patients who have sudden cardiac death? He had ventricular fibrillation. Look at the bottom over here. You see the artery blocked suddenly and you see the blood clot in the artery, and he was unable to be resuscitated. Now, when people have ventricular fibrillation outside the hospital unwitnessed, there's only a 10% survival rate. And if it's witnessed, it's 30%. So what's so important to understand is that Tim Russert, who had a stress test 2 months before he died, did not have detected coronary disease from that stress test because his blockage was less than 70%. But he had plaque rupture. And plaque rupture, as I pointed out to you, can result in a blood clot and sudden cardiac death. So now, what happens if we find out that you've got a blockage? And many of you know this, and some of you have stents. We can go in, and Dr. Maurice Bookbinder, and I used to do this in the past, is an absolute expert at going in. We put a little tube with a stent around the tube into your artery, and here you see a stent in the coronary artery. And this here is an example of a blocked artery where we stent the artery, and here you see on the right-hand side how the artery is completely open. Now, if that happens suddenly, that causes a heart attack. But if you get into the hospital and to the cath lab right away, it can be opened with a stent. This is carotid stenting. Here you see a very tight blockage in the carotid artery that goes up to the neck, and here it is after a stent put in. We can put a stent into an artery if we can detect it early enough. And that means you've got to be lucky enough to have a symptom that'll bring you to the doctor and that you have a test where we detect this disease. But what happens when you don't have an obstruction that causes symptoms? You're at risk for sudden stroke or cardiac death. And so what does it mean? It means that you have to know whether you are sitting with a high-risk situation with underlying heart disease, plaque in the carotid arteries or in the coronary arteries, and you are still asymptomatic because you don't have a significant blockage. In other words, it's less than 70%. So this is one of the mainstays of my talk today. I want you to know about something called a calcium scan, which I use a huge amount in my practice to try to decide if somebody has underlying coronary artery disease. And you can see you go into a calcium scan, like into a CT scan. It's very simple. It takes less than 5 minutes. There's minimal amount of radiation. And we can find out from this calcium scan whether you have plaque, what we call calcified plaque in the coronary artery. And you see a picture here of this calcified plaque that's actually sitting in one of these coronary arteries. What does the score mean? The score means that if you've got a score of 0, there's no evidence of coronary artery disease, and it goes all the way over 400 when there's extensive evidence of coronary artery disease. And what this tells us as doctors and healthcare providers, that if your score is 0, you are at very low risk. You've got a risk of 0.1% over the next 3 to 5 years. If it's over 400, your risk is much higher, and it's absolutely imperative that you get stress testing and you get diagnostic testing to make sure that we understand the extent of the disease and if something needs to be done. So here's an example of a calcium scan where you see the calcium in the scan, and here is a normal carotid scan, and here's an abnormal carotid scan, because we can scan the carotid too with an ultrasound. So let me go to this part of my talk. My friend and colleague, Dr. Frank Gaylor, said to me, please, will you answer this question? Should we take statins? What if I can't take a statin or I don't want to? And should I take supplements? That's another question that I get asked all the time. Can I or should I take supplements, and can they replace the statin? So obviously the answer depends on who you ask. Let's go back to my first slide where I said to you, if you're talking to a Western trained allopathic medicine doctor who is a lipidologist like myself, he will very much lean towards wanting to put you on a statin. And if you go to somebody that's in the very holistic world, he'll say, well, I think statins are terrible and you shouldn't take them, and I'm going to give you something that you can take instead of a statin. And I really believe that it is very, very important that you understand that there are certain times where a statin is absolutely indicated. And I'm going to explain to you now, when are statins absolutely indicated? These are the statin benefit groups from the AHA and the ACC. We're not getting into this, but this is in detail who should get a statin. And what I did is I summarized it for you. This is called secondary prevention. These are people who've already had an event and we're trying to prevent them having another event. So there's no controversy here that people who have had an event need to be on a statin to lower their LDL cholesterol as much as possible. So anyone with cardiovascular disease, prior heart attack, stroke, or a stent, anybody who has had a transient ischemic attack, that's a pre-stroke symptoms, prior angioplasty or stenting, or peripheral vascular disease, and here's an example of someone with an aneurysm, that is peripheral vascular disease, and of course you can get blockages in your legs as well. What about primary prevention? And this is really where I think Franklin was asking me the question. Who should consider a statin for primary prevention? And this is the high-risk group of patients that we have to think about it. Smokers, diabetes, hypertension, family history, people who have a very high LDL cholesterol. There's something called familial hyperlipidemia. This is where people have a very, very high LDL cholesterol based on their family history. There's nothing they can do about it in terms of diet or exercise. And a lot of times there's somebody in the family that died young, that had a heart attack at less than age 55. The families, the children, the siblings of this type of person who has this familial hyperlipidemia should be seen. They should have their numbers checked, and they should be on statins early and statins forever, unless there's a contraindication. Obesity, stress, and the other thing we can do is look at the 10-year risk score, which I'm not going to go into now, but there is something called the ASCVD risk estimator, and that is something that's an app, and you can actually put your numbers in and see if your 10-year risk is above 7.5%. So this is the high-risk group of people where we need to consider a statin. So what I am going to tell you is that I screen these people in two ways to try to find out if they need a statin. One is I do something called advanced lipid testing. I'm now down to just really focusing on the LPA, which is part of the LDL particle, and it's very atherogenic. It means it's more likely to cause plaque deposition. So that is a test you should ask your doctor for if you're in this high-risk group and you're trying to decide whether to be on a statin. Check your LPA. It is genetically determined, and so if your LPA is high, that's very often something that's being given to you in your genes by somebody in your family, and you should be aggressive about treating your cholesterol. The other test that I do is a calcium scan. And you can see, and I showed you before, how helpful that is. Because if the calcium scan is high, is abnormal, I want to be aggressive because those people already have plaque. Now, what about people who don't want statins? They just don't want to know about it. They think they're bad for you. They think they're going to give you side effects. And what are the options? And I just wanted to, there are patients who I use these two agents. Now, the one is called bergamot, and the other is red yeast rice. Red yeast rice actually is a statin. And the point that you should know about it, yes, it's over the counter, but you have to make sure you're getting it from a reputable company. And in most of the time, I will say, take a statin from a pharmaceutical company, and I use red yeast rice when someone refuses to take a statin, but they prepare to take something so-called natural, and they'll take red yeast rice. But in preference to that, I like this product called bergamot. I took it myself, and I just want to show you the study. My cholesterol came down 60 points. So here's a little study that was done. The cholesterol went from 245 to 182, the LDL 162 to 101. This is something to consider if you've got a high cholesterol and you have a scan and you've got 0 on your score. You've got no plaque in your carotids and your LPA is normal. So here's a case study from someone who's part of SAGAC who called me and asked me for an opinion. And I'm using her case because it's such a good example of what I'm talking about here today. This lovely lady, 63, she's got risk factors. Her father died at age 47 of a heart attack. That's a strong family history. And look at her lipid panel. Cholesterol of 303, LDL 189. The HDL, the good cholesterol, is high and fantastic, and the triglycerides are normal. Her question was, should I be on a statin? And as I've just told you, the way I approach this is, and I said to her, I want to know what your LPA is, and I want to know what your calcium score is. Her calcium score was 0. And this is what it looks like when it's 0. And this is when you have plaque. Now, she's got a very high LDL cholesterol, and she has a positive family history. But as long as her score is 0, her risk is very, very low. So the question should be, should you be on a statin because you've got such a strong family history? And the answer is when your LDL gets to 190, you need a statin anyway. And she's very close to that. I would like to see her LPA. And as long as her score is 0 and her LPA is normal, I think it's not unreasonable to try bergamet and see what happens. But this is a type of situation where she should be on something to bring her LDL cholesterol down. And 99%, I think most doctors would put her on a statin. I'm telling you, if the score is 0, I'm more comfortable in trying to avoid a statin as long as we're keeping an eye on her calcium score. And that means every 5 years. So these are supplements. And should you take supplements? I've got another few minutes here and I'm going to go through this very quickly. I went to see this gentleman at the GNC store. And while I was there, I wanted to ask him, what supplements do you think people should use for cardiovascular disease? And while I was there, a whole lot of people came in and asked him about what they should use for arthritis and this and that. And he took stuff off the shelf and people just said, no problem, I'll take it. And they paid. And I said to him, how come people just take what you give them? Been studying for 13 years. I can't get people to take stuff that I give them. I said, you must have gone to learn all about this. And he said, I did. I went to a 6-week course. And what it says is that people are more likely to believe someone in the supplement store than they are to believe a specialist. And that's because they're suspicious and they'd rather not take medication. But as I've tried to say to you today, be smart. Make sure you understand your risk and make sure you know when is a medication indicated and when can you take supplements. So it's all about food. If we can eat healthy food, we get most of the nutrients we need. This is the list of supplements that I consider and I discuss with patients because I think they're helpful, especially in people who are not eating a healthy diet and not getting adequate amounts of fruit and vegetables. A multivitamin, vitamin D, magnesium, CoQ10, fish oil or krill oil, vitamin E, and berberine. So I'm not going to go into these now. Any of you are welcome to be in touch with me, and I'm happy to discuss them. This is a very nice article from NLA Lipid Spin from 2007, the impact of supplements, nutraceuticals on lipid levels, what works and how well, and they discuss a lot of the things that I discussed. So I am a believer in magnesium. This is a slide just showing you where we get a lot of magnesium. The body doesn't make magnesium. I wrote a book about magnesium. I think you should know that magnesium is extremely important. And if you're magnesium deficient, you can have all sorts of problems. I think that when you've got a healthy, normal magnesium level, it can help you to avoid heart attacks, lower blood pressure, stop painful muscle cramps, nagging, insomnia. It increases calcium absorption, and it can help with headaches. Magnesium is very important for many of our pathways. There are over 350 enzyme systems depending on magnesium, and magnesium converts ADP to ATP. So I am a believer in magnesium, and I do think that it's important to take it, and the dose is 1 milligram. The dose is 3 milligrams per pound. So for average women, it's 400 milligrams a day, and for men, it's 500. What about K2? I'm not going to get into this now, but it is another supplement out there that is becoming very popular. And I actually wrote about K2 as well. And at first, I was very excited about it as a supplement. But what the idea is with K2 is that it actually increases calcification of bones, and it is hopefully going to take calcium and keep it out of arteries. So there's been some really good studies about this, but it's mainly helpful in people who have a high dietary intake of K2. And what was fascinating in Japan is that people in Eastern Japan who actually ate more natto had fewer fractures. In Western Japan, where they didn't eat much natto, which is full of vitamin K2, they had less fractures. So I'm not going to go into this. This is a Rotterdam study for cardiovascular disease showing that people who ate good amounts of vitamin K2, high amounts in their diet, had actually, in this particular study with a lot of patients, they had a reduction in cardiovascular mortality of 50% and 25% reduction in mortality. That's the book I wrote about K2. But what I want to say on the bottom line is, I think if you can, you should think about taking natto, which is this fermented soy. This is a lady that I know, Ann Yonatani. She's in New York and she makes New York natto. She's a microbiologist, and you should take a look at her stuff, because if you can tolerate this, I really believe there's benefit. And vitamin K2, if you take it as a supplement, is 180 micrograms a day. But the bottom line on K2 is the data is still not clear that if you take it as a supplement, you're going to have major benefit. Vitamin D is so important. I'm not going to go into this now. When you go and look at the recording, you'll see all these points about vitamin D. Sleep is so important. If you're snoring, you're waking up tired, you're falling asleep during the day, you need to think about sleep apnea. These are the symptoms: snoring, fatigue, headaches, irregular breathing, insomnia, daytime sleeping. There are many cardiovascular problems associated with sleep, with bad sleep and sleep apnea. And here they are: hypertension, arrhythmias, heart attack, stroke, depression, diabetes, obesity, and MVA. So let me please implore you, get yourself a sleep study. You can do it at home. All you do is put a little monitor on your finger. It's an oximeter, and you can be screened for sleep apnea. It's extremely important to rule that out. It is a risk factor for heart disease. What about stress? It's a major risk factor.
I hate to cut you off, but we are at time here.
Okay, I'm just going to do one thing here, which is to come to my last slide.
Okay.
And tell you that this is what I am at NYU, and this is the website where I do a lot of public lectures, and you can get a lot of information. And here's my last two slides. This is my favorite, one of my favorite slides. What day is it? Asked Pooh. It's today, squeaked Piglet. My favorite day, said Pooh. What did he mean by that? And I got this slide from my friend Karen Marcus, and I think it's summarized by saying, I'm at peace with my past. I'm in love with my present. I'm excited for the future. So thank you very, very much for listening. I want to thank Pam and Kaylee and Joel and my amazing faculty for this opportunity to put on this conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goodman. I am happy to introduce Dr. Neil Gordon next. Dr. Gordon is the co-founder and CEO of Intervent International. He obtained his MD and PhD in exercise physiology at WITS in South Africa before relocating to the US, where he obtained a master's degree in public health from UCLA. He is a fellow of the American College of Cardiology and has authored over 120 published scientific manuscripts, 8 books, and numerous scientific abstracts on the topic of chronic disease prevention and management. He also served as an associate editor of the American College of Sports Medicine's guidelines for exercise testing and prescription, the world's most widely read academic text on the topic of exercise science. Dr. Gordon is a former chairman of the American Heart Association's National Committee on Exercise, Cardiac Rehabilitation, and Prevention. Dr. Gordon, take it away.
Thank you, Kaylee, and thank you, Dr. Goodman, for inviting me to present as part of this important symposium. It's an absolute pleasure for me to talk to you today on the topic harnessing e-health for heart attack and stroke prevention. Next slide, please. I've decided to divide my presentation into 5 major parts. First, I will start off by discussing some of the challenges and the opportunities facing us in the field of heart disease and stroke prevention. When doing so, I will emphasize some of the points that Dr. Goodman has already made. Second, I will review what is known as the cardiovascular disease causal chain. Third, I will discuss some of the key steps that we should all be taking to reduce our personal risk. I'll do this from a very high-level perspective. Fourth, I will shift gears and focus on harnessing mobile health technology and other e-health technologies to facilitate cardiovascular disease risk reduction. And then I will end off by sharing with you results from some of the studies that we've been involved in utilizing e-health. Next slide, please. You know, if you stop and think about it for a few moments, we've all been extremely fortunate in that we've seen some amazing technological advances in the field of cardiovascular medicine during our lifetimes. Coming from South Africa, the one that always stands out in my mind is the first heart transplant performed by the late Professor Chris Barnard in Cape Town in 1967. Unfortunately, though, despite all of these impressive advances, cardiovascular disease, which, as we've already heard, is to a large degree potentially preventable, remains the leading cause of premature death, disability, and escalating healthcare costs. What's even more unfortunate is that it doesn't appear that the situation is going to improve significantly in the foreseeable future. Next slide, please. In fact, we may be headed toward a worsening of the situation. And I say that on the basis of recent deleterious or negative risk factor trends, such as the alarming increase in obesity, coupled with the detrimental impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. What's happened is that the cardiovascular disease pandemic and the COVID-19 pandemic have collided to create what I like to refer to as a perfect storm in which each is contributing to the worsening of the other. And this is causing even greater attention to be focused on heart disease and stroke prevention. Next slide, please. Now, the good news is that, as Dr. Goodman has already pointed out, most common chronic diseases are to a large degree lifestyle related and potentially preventable. This slide has data from a paper published in the journal Science in 2002, an article authored by Dr. Walter Willett from Harvard University, in which he calculated that a handful of lifestyle practices, which we'll be hearing more about throughout today's session, are responsible for about 82% of coronary artery disease and about 70% of stroke. So as Dr. Goodman said, making lifestyle changes is critically important. Next slide. I'm now going to go on to discuss what is referred to as the cardiovascular disease causal chain. But before doing so, I'd like to re-emphasize another point that Dr. Goodman made, and that's about the fact that your genes are not your destiny. And to do this, I'd like to tell you a quick story. Next slide. Over the years, I've had the immense privilege of working not only with tens of thousands of patients with cardiovascular disease and other chronic illnesses, but also with many healthy individuals, some of whom have been athletes. In fact, some have been world-class athletes. For example, I helped tennis great Jimmy Connors with his diet and exercise program when he made his big comeback at the US Open at the age of 39. And we wrote a book together called Don't Count Yourself Out, Staying Fit After 35. In those days, we used to think that 35 was old, and now it seems really young. And for those of you with very good vision, you'll see that my name featured prominently on the front cover of the book. But I tell you the story to emphasize this point. Jimmy, like many great athletes, has immense genetic potential, immense genetic capabilities. However, what I can tell you is that he also put in an immense amount of hard work and training. And without all of the effort that he put in, nobody would know who Jimmy Connors is or any of the great athletes. So like Dr. Goodman said, think of it like a gun. Our genes loads the gun, but it's our environment and our lifestyle that pulls the trigger. And unfortunately, when it does, that gun's often pointed at our heart, causing heart attacks, and at our brain, causing strokes. But genes are definitely not your destiny. And what we're talking about tonight is even more important if you have a family history of heart disease or stroke. Next slide, please. In this slide, we can see what is referred to as the cardiovascular disease causal chain. Very briefly, we have behavioral risk factors such as cigarette smoking, physical inactivity, incorrect nutrition, and excessive stress. These are harmful in and of themselves, but they also result in a worsening of physiological risk factors such as body mass index, blood pressure, cholesterol, and blood glucose levels, which in turn result in an increased risk for the development of and progression of heart disease and stroke. Collectively, all of these factors also increase susceptibility to COVID-19 and are associated with a greater severity and poorer outcome. Next slide. So really the key is to break that causal chain at every link along the way. And as we've heard, the key to that is the combination of comprehensive lifestyle changes together with appropriate drug therapy, for example, to control our blood pressure, our cholesterol, and our blood glucose. And that brings us to some of the key steps that we can take to reduce our personal risk. Next slide. In 2003, there was a very interesting article published in the British Medical Journal in which the author spoke about the need for a so-called cardioprotective polypill. That is one pill containing 5 different medications that could lower our risk for cardiovascular disease. I collaborated with a number of my colleagues, and we published a manuscript in the American Journal of Cardiology in which we said, wait a minute, there is already a cardioprotective polypill. It's called lifestyle modification. Next slide. In the manuscript, we quoted the editor of the American Journal of Cardiology, Dr. Bill Roberts, who more than 2 decades prior to our publication summarized it best by describing exercise, in this case running, as an agent with lipid-lowering, antihypertensive, positive inotropic, negative chronotropic, vasodilating, diuretic, anorexigenic, weight-reducing, cathartic, hypoglycemic, tranquilizing, hypnotic, and antidepressive qualities. And I know for those of you who aren't medical professionals, you may not have understood some of those terms, but I can tell you that they're all very beneficial. And if you doubt me, you just have to try it for yourself and you'll see how beneficial it is. Next slide, please. We concluded our manuscript by saying that when they do come out with a cardioprotective polypill, it needs to be accompanied by user directions stating, take medication each day in the prescribed dosage, followed or preceded by at least 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity in combination with a low-fat, low-cholesterol diet, weight management, and the avoidance or cessation of cigarette smoking. Now, some of those dietary guidelines have evolved over time, but the key point, again, that I'm trying to emphasize is the importance of lifestyle intervention. Next slide, please. The American Heart Association has attempted to make things very simple, and they've published what are known as Life's Simple 7, the 7 approaches that they believe are most important to staying heart healthy. And they are as follows. 1, be active. 2, keep a healthy weight. 3, learn about cholesterol. 4, do not smoke or use smokeless tobacco. 5, eat a heart-healthy diet. 6, keep blood pressure healthy. And 7, learn about blood sugar and diabetes and keep your values in the desired range. I understand from some of the comments that you may not be able to see me, but unfortunately, I do have my camera on, so I'm not really sure what else that I can do about that. I'm going to simply continue speaking. Next slide, please. I'm going to speak a little bit more about exercise. Some of our other excellent speakers will be going into nutrition in more detail. One of the aspects related to exercise that has attracted recent attention is some of the risks of exercise, in particular, potential dangers of performing too much exercise. For many years, we've known that exercise is very beneficial, but we've also known that there are certain negative potential consequences. And in fact, I published a manuscript in the South African Medical Journal way back in 1982, if you can believe it, entitled Exercise: A Need for Careful Prescription, in which we emphasized that the benefits of exercise far outweigh the risks. Next slide, please. In 2007, I was a co-author on a scientific statement from the American Heart Association entitled Exercise and Acute Cardiovascular Events, Placing the Risks into Perspective. And again, we concluded that the benefits of exercise far outweigh any of the risks associated with exercise. Next slide, please. Last year, that scientific statement was updated, and they focused more attention in the update on the potential adverse consequences of performing too much exercise. Next slide. In South Africa at Wits University in 2018, I delivered a presentation entitled Exercising for Cardiovascular Health is More Better or Worse? And this slide summarizes some of the conclusions that I reached, and I'll just go through them very quickly for you. The conclusions are that even small amounts of physical activity are beneficial, even activities such as standing. So if you've been sitting all this time, you may want to stand up and then you can sit down again. The benefits continue to increase until you hit a certain volume of exercise, at which benefits from a cardiovascular health perspective begin to plateau off, and that's at exercise volumes of about 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity aerobic exercise, such as brisk walking, or 75 minutes per week of vigorous intensity aerobic exercise, such as jogging. So once you hit that volume of exercise, the benefits continue, but they start to plateau off. And some of the more recent research has raised the possibility that once you exceed another level of exercise, then it could potentially result in deleterious cardiac effects. But far more research is needed on this topic. And for those of you who are very active, we'd encourage you to continue leading your active lifestyle. The benefits are likely to far outweigh any of the small potential risks. So the conclusion is that more is not always necessarily better, but additional research is needed to truly determine if more is actually worse. Next slide, please. I'm going to shift gears now and focus on harnessing e-health and mobile health technology to facilitate lifestyle intervention and cardiovascular disease risk reduction. Next slide. It is very difficult to get people to make and adhere to meaningful lifestyle changes. It's not easy. I can tell you with all of my years of experience, it is challenging. But if you adopt the right approach, we can be successful. And for each of you as individuals, it's definitely well worth the effort. One of the big challenges is that we live in what I like to refer to as a toxic environment. And by toxic environment, I don't necessarily mean the air that we breathe. I mean the fact that we've managed to re-engineer healthy lifestyles out of our daily routines. We've made it harder for people to exercise and to eat a healthy diet. On the left-hand side of the slide, he's saying, I'm willing to make some changes in my lifestyle as long as I don't have to do anything different. Now, fortunately, we've learned a lot about behavioral science and how to work with people to help them make changes in their lifestyle. And fortunately, we are now able to leverage newer technologies such as e-health and digital health to facilitate healthy living. Next slide, please. In this slide, we can see the wide array of digital health tools that are available, ranging from the many apps that you're all familiar with to connected devices and sensors. In 2017, the results from an interesting survey were published in which they concluded that there were over 318,000 health apps available at that time worldwide, and more than 200 new health apps were being introduced through Apple Store and Google Play per day on average. So it's virtually impossible to keep up with all of the different apps, and I encourage you to speak to your healthcare providers for information on the best apps to utilize. Next slide. There is a more recent survey that was published just as COVID-19 was getting started. And interestingly, in this survey, they showed that usage of mobile phone apps and wearable technology, fitness trackers, etc., increased from 2014 to 2018, and then actually decreased from 2018 to 2020. And the main reason for that was concerns about data privacy. Next slide. One of the benefits of the COVID-19 pandemic has been that consumers have now been exposed to the benefits of telemedicine and telehealth and are now familiar with it and are now more comfortable in sharing data through these approaches. And we're starting to see again an uptick in the usage of e-health, mobile devices and other digital devices, which is potentially very useful. Next slide. The American Heart Association, a month or so ago, published a scientific statement in which they concluded that such technologies are immensely beneficial even for older individuals. However, they also pointed out that these technologies should not be used in isolation, and they should be used as part of a comprehensive intervention. Next slide. We've spent probably over 20 years now evaluating different transformative digital and other technologies and incorporating them into the programs and services that we provide. These services have now been used by over 2 million individuals on a global basis. For anyone who's interested, we published an interesting chapter in a well-known textbook. It was entitled Using Digital Health Technology to Promote Cardiovascular Disease Risk Reduction in Secondary Prevention. And in the article, I won't go into it, we talk about the value of digital health, precision health, or personalized health, and using what is referred to as big data. Next slide, please. This slide provides a high-level overview of certain of the programs that we provide, in which we combine high-tech with high-touch. Individuals work using telehealth with health coaches, but in between coaching sessions through online applications, they have access to a variety of resources, including the ability to sync a variety of different tracking devices, fitness trackers, blood glucose monitors, blood pressure monitors, Bluetooth scales, etc. Next slide, please. And I'm going to try to go through some of these slides quite quickly. I saw there was a question earlier about carotid artery disease. The program that we've developed is now being used by all patients as part of a large multi-center NIH-funded clinical trial. It involves over 130 medical centers. It's a study evaluating different interventions to treat individuals with blockages in their carotid arteries. And as part of the study, all of the individuals participate in our telehealth coaching program. If you have carotid artery disease, you may want to speak to your doctor about this study called CREST-2. Participation in the telehealth coaching program is free of charge. Next slide. Our program's also being used as part of the Canadian Diabetes Prevention Program, which targets individuals who have a condition called prediabetes, where your blood glucose level is elevated, but not high enough for a diagnosis of diabetes. If any of you live in Canada, you should look into this study. Again, participation is free of charge. Next slide, please. Dr. Goodman mentioned the American College of Cardiology's ASCVD risk estimator, that's atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease risk estimator. I'd encourage you to go online, enter your information, you receive various risk scores, next slide, and you also receive personalized advice on lifestyle and medications. Next slide. To end off this section of the presentation, another useful site is Healthline, where you can review reviews on a variety of different apps. To end off, I'm going to very quickly go through 3 or 4 final slides. We can go to the next slide and skip by that and go into this slide. This slide shows results from one of the studies utilizing the program that we've developed. It was published in the American Journal of Cardiology in 2004, showing that a large percentage of individuals could normalize their risk factors with the use of lifestyle intervention alone. Interestingly, 37% of individuals with type 2 diabetes reversed their type 2 diabetes without medication. Next slide. In another study of ours published earlier this month, we showed that in individuals with prediabetes, about 45% could reverse their prediabetes without medication. Next slide, please. It's my belief that it is possible to eradicate many forms of heart disease and stroke in our lifetimes. Although genetics is important, that will not be the key. The key will be getting people to lead healthy lifestyles and the appropriate use of medications to control risk factors where needed. Next slide. This is my final slide. When it comes to lifestyle intervention, I like to refer to lifestyle intervention as the best medicine that most doctors and most people are not using. If you're not leading an active lifestyle and a healthy lifestyle, I would strongly encourage you to do so. It will be the best thing that you can do to reduce your risk for heart disease and stroke. Thank you for your attention, and my apologies for any technological problems.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gordon. Next on our panel, we have Melissa Alizraki. Melissa is a registered dietitian and certified diabetes care and education specialist. She currently works with patients at the NYU Langone Center for the Prevention of Cardiovascular Disease and NYU Diabetes and Endocrine Associates. Melissa is passionate about empowering patients to meet their health goals and sharing her love of food. So Melissa, go ahead.
Thank you, Kaylee. Good evening, everyone. And thank you so much, Dr. Goodman, for inviting me here to speak with you all. You can go to the next slide. Today, we will review a few eating patterns that I frequently recommend for heart health. So first, we'll talk about a few eating patterns that I frequently recommend for heart health and discuss what those eating patterns have in common. Then we'll talk about some of the benefits of eating seasonally. And finally, we'll talk about ways to incorporate seasonal produce into a heart-healthy diet this spring and summer. We've certainly just had a lot of convincing arguments for thinking about food choice to promote good heart health. Next slide. Now, in our profession, the conversation is really starting to shift away from just individual nutrients and towards overall dietary pattern. So I thought it would be good to start with a definition. Next slide. Here is a very technical looking one for you, but ultimately a dietary pattern is the big picture. It encompasses everything you eat and drink, accounting for the relative frequency with which you choose different foods and beverages. Next slide. Before the government releases the US dietary guidelines every 5 years, a committee of very bright people sits down and does an exhaustive review of all of our recent research on diet and health. And when they were preparing for the 2020 report that recently came out, they found that there was a stronger association between overall dietary pattern and health outcome than there was with any individual nutrient. And that's probably because we don't go to the store and buy potassium or saturated fat. We eat foods with multiple nutrients in various combinations. So patterns probably better represent the way we actually eat. And it also accounts for any potential interactions that may be happening among nutrients within one food or a combination of foods. In other words, the salmon might be great, but the salmon with some spinach and some quinoa, even better, because there could be interactions happening between those nutrients. Next slide. First, we're going to talk about the DASH eating plan. That stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. This is a plan that emphasizes fruits, vegetables, whole grains, fat-free and low-fat dairy, fish, poultry, beans, nuts and vegetable oils. And if you look at a daily meal plan on the DASH diet, you'll see that it's probably more servings of fruits and vegetables than most of us are getting in the standard American diet. This plan limits fatty meat, full-fat dairy, tropical vegetable oils, including coconut oil, sugar-sweetened beverages, snacks, and sweets. And there are a few features that set this plan apart from the other eating patterns. It does make specific sodium recommendations, recommending a maximum of 2,300 milligrams of sodium daily, with an option to pull back to 1,500 to further lower blood pressure if desired. It also emphasizes achieving a very specific mineral intake, in particular, increasing potassium, magnesium, and calcium intake. It encourages the use of fat-free and low-fat dairy daily, and it does limit overall fat intake, even from unsaturated fats, which we now know are part of some heart-healthy eating patterns. Next slide. And this is an eating plan that was designed in the 1990s for clinical trials, specifically to lower blood pressure, and it worked in those trials. We think that this plan may be particularly effective for lowering blood pressure because of that mineral profile, which may help promote appropriate blood vessel relaxation. And since the 90s, we have had plenty of trials continue to show benefit of this eating plan for heart health. We've seen it associated not only with lower blood pressure, but also with weight loss, with decreased LDL cholesterol, and that's the bad cholesterol, that's the one you want less of. It's associated with decreased risk of coronary artery disease, decreased risk of developing type 2 diabetes, and finally, decreased risk of death from all causes, as well as death from cardiovascular disease in particular. Next slide. Moving on to talk about the Mediterranean diet, this plan also emphasizes fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. Protein is encouraged primarily from seafood, legumes, nuts, and seeds, with smaller amounts of poultry, eggs, and dairy. That comes primarily from unsaturated plant sources, especially olive oil and nuts. This eating pattern also limits sugar and red meat. And for me, the defining feature of the Mediterranean diet is that real emphasis on liberal intake of unsaturated fats. When we look at the food pyramid here, we see foods like avocado and olive oil and nuts right there in the base of the pyramid, alongside fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. And while we do want to keep an eye on the big picture, just to talk a bit about why we think this plan works well, all of those plant foods and seafoods that this plan emphasizes are really going to give you a ton of protective antioxidants, lots of fiber, and lots of unsaturated fats, while it limits the foods that tend to be higher in saturated fats. Next slide. Researchers became interested in this eating pattern when studies, even dating back to the 60s, showed that some populations in the Mediterranean region were experiencing lower rates of death from coronary heart disease, and they thought it might have something to do with the way they were eating. Since then, we have had studies in every corner of the globe looking at this diet, and we tend to see benefits for heart health. We've had observational studies where we just kind of watch what people were doing and then what happened to them, and we see decreased risk for coronary disease. And we've also had randomized control trials, which are sort of our gold standard for evidence, where we put someone on a diet, compare what happens to them with someone who wasn't on that diet, and look for outcomes. And we do see, for example, here, lower rates of cardiac death, as well as the PrediMed style, which got a lot of press. And I think we had an image from it already this evening, where we saw decreased risk of cardiac events on the Mediterranean diet, in particular, decreased risk of stroke. Next slide, please. So from all of these studies, we have evidence suggesting that the Mediterranean diet is associated with lower weight, lower total cholesterol, and lower LDL cholesterol, the bad one, lower triglycerides, with higher HDL cholesterol. That's the one you want more of. That's the good one. It's been associated with lower blood sugar, lower blood pressure, and decreased risk of cardiovascular disease in general, as well as stroke and coronary heart disease in particular. So there's certainly a lot to like with this plan. Next slide. Finally, for our third pattern, we have mounting evidence supporting the use of a plant-based diet for heart health. And this could encompass a few different patterns. It could be a vegan diet, which doesn't include any animal products of any kind, a lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet, which would include some eggs and dairy. It could also be a semi-vegetarian diet, or what you may now hear referred to as a flexitarian diet. This would be an eating pattern that's primarily vegetarian, but can include some occasional fish, poultry, or meat. If you're a Mark Bittman fan, this is kind of the idea of his book VB5, where he was vegan all day long, and then he decided that in the evening, he would eat those other foods in moderation. Next slide. We have a good deal of evidence on the benefits of plant-based eating for heart health from the Adventist health studies. Many Seventh-day Adventists limit consumption of animal products for religious reasons, so they make a nice natural sample set for us. And from studies in this population, we have seen that vegetarians had lower risk of death from cardiovascular disease. We saw that vegetarians were less likely to have hypertension and high cholesterol, and we saw that they were less likely to carry fat around their midsections. Next slide. Now, plant-based eating has been getting a lot of buzz lately. Even Dunkin' Donuts and Burger King are offering meatless options, which is how I know we've reached critical mass on this. And people are pursuing this eating pattern, not just for health, but also for moral and environmental reasons, which is great. But then I think it's important for us to pause here and think about what is the optimal implementation of a plant-based eating pattern if your goal is heart health. Because when we look at the images of these two grocery aisles, while they both contain plant foods, I think we can all agree that they are going to act really differently in our bodies. So we want to think about what types of plant foods we're including in our diet. Next slide. And I wanted to share this one graph because I think it illustrates the point so beautifully. We're going to focus on figure A, the graph on the left. This is from a study in which researchers looked at the association between plant-based eating and risk for coronary heart disease, but they took into account the types of plant foods that different subjects were consuming. So when we look at figure A, if you look at the red line that's trending down from the x-axis, that is showing us that the subjects who ate more fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds decreased their risk for coronary heart disease. And when we look at the dashed gray line that's trending up from the x-axis, that's showing us that the subjects who ate more refined grains, sweets, sugar-sweetened beverages, and juice actually increased the risk for coronary heart disease. So I think that this teaches us a lot of valuable lessons. First of all, it confirms for us that yes, the types of plants you choose do matter if what you're thinking of is decreasing your risk for cardiovascular disease. It tells us the types of plants we want to be eating to improve our health. And I like that it also shows us that it doesn't have to be all or nothing. I think it really supports that idea of the flexitarian diet, because when we look at that line, it's sort of showing us that any amount that you can increase your intake of those healthful plant foods, you can incrementally confer benefit for decreased risk of coronary heart disease. Next slide. So if we take a moment to reflect on those three eating patterns that we just discussed, some common themes start to emerge, and I think you can take these away as your sort of heart-healthy eating headlines. Next slide. First and foremost, no matter what eating pattern you choose, whether it's one of these, whether it's low carb, low fat, I don't care. To me, the most important thing is to primarily eat whole or minimally processed foods. The less it's broken down and futzed with outside your body, the better. Next slide. Eat lots of plants. Yes, even the ones with carbohydrates and naturally occurring sugars, like fruits, whole grains, and legumes. Next slide. Get most of your fat from plants. That would be vegetable oils, nuts, or avocado. Next slide. Low-fat dairy, fish, eggs, and lean poultry can be incorporated, but it may be best to use some of these foods in moderation depending on your medical history and your goals. And finally, fatty meats, red meats, animal fats, added sugar, refined carbohydrates, and packaged snacks should probably be used sparingly. And these little piggies agree, less meat sounds like a really good idea. Next slide. Now that we have a sense of the overall pattern that we want to aim for, let's talk about eating seasonally. And to talk about seasonal eating is really to talk about eating local, right? The idea is that you want to draw on the foods that are being harvested in your region at that time. Next slide. There are many benefits to us as the consumer when we eat seasonally. First of all, it usually costs less. It's also a great way to vary your diet, and variety is good nutrition because each fruit and vegetable is going to give you a slightly different profile of vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants. You're also likely to get superior quality and taste when you eat seasonally because a food that was grown near you and in that season is usually allowed to ripen more before being harvested. Are you going to get better nutrition if you eat seasonally? You might, it's possible. There was a study in iceberg lettuce that showed that there was some decrease in the content of some nutrients by the time it had been sitting on shelves at stores for 3 or 4 days. There are really a lot of factors that go into the nutrient content of foods. For example, soil quality might be one of them. But ultimately, in general, the longer your food has to spend in transit and on the shelves of the grocery store, the more likely it is to lose some nutrients. Next slide. Eating seasonally is also good for your local economy because you are supporting the farms and the agriculture in your area. And finally, eating seasonally can be good for the environment. Here we are looking at a chart comparing food miles between locally grown foods and foods that are not grown locally. And food miles refers to the distance that your food has to travel from the farm to your plate. You can sort of think of it like the carbon footprint of your food because that travel is going to require some fuel and probably create some emissions. So this chart is showing us that we can decrease the environmental impact of our food choices by eating foods that were grown closer to our home, and that means eating what's in season. Next slide. Okay, you're convinced. So where can you buy seasonal produce? Your local supermarket is a perfectly good place to start. Usually when you go down the produce aisle, there will be signs with a price, and somewhere on there it will often say where the produce was grown. I think especially as consumers, I think we've become more interested in where our food is coming from with this whole farm to table movement. So you can start there. Farmers markets are also a really good way to buy directly from local growers. You can find out more information on farmers markets in your area by going to the Farm Bureau of San Diego County's website. You can also go to sandiegocounty.gov and navigate to the Department of Agriculture Weights and Measures. You can select farmers markets under their popular services if you don't know where your local farmers market is. And finally, you could consider joining a CSA. That stands for Community Supported Agriculture. In a CSA, you buy a share of a local farmer's crop in advance. So it does mean that you have to be able to lay out the money for a few months of produce in advance. And then every week during the season, the farm will bring a truckload of produce, all the shares, to a drop point in your neighborhood, and you go pick it up. You get your share. It means that you are locked in for whatever is harvested week to week. I think that that can be a great thing. It's a good way to increase variety in your diet. It's a fun way to challenge yourself, to try new things. I like to think of it as our own personal little chopped basket, if you are a fan of the Food Network, like I am. It might involve working a shift to help with the distribution. I think that can also be a fun way to create community and meet your neighbors. These pictures here are actually pictures of my daughter shortly before her second birthday, dutifully unloading kale at one of our CSA shifts, and she really enjoys it. She keeps asking when we're going to do it again. If you are interested in joining a CSA, just Googling the name of your city and CSA is a good place to start, but you can also go to the website localharvest.org/CSA. Next slide. Now let's put it all together. Let's talk about what's in season in Southern California this spring and summer. And I am not ashamed to admit that as a New Yorker, your harvest calendar makes me more than just a little bit jealous, but that's okay. Even in sunny California, eventually the growing season ends for some of the produce. So let's highlight a few of the foods you might want to look for in the warmer months to move towards a heart-healthy eating pattern. And let's talk about some really delicious ways that you can try including them. Next slide. Let's start off with asparagus. Asparagus is usually one of those first crops to show up early in the spring, though in the southernmost part of California, you might start seeing it at the end of winter. The season is relatively short, though. You got to get it while the getting is good. Asparagus is a good source of fiber, vitamin A, and folate, and I think it's really versatile. You can actually eat it raw or cooked. If you're eating it raw, you want to shave it thinly, maybe with a vegetable peeler. You can dress that with some lemon juice and olive oil. It would be tasty with some slivered almonds on top or maybe some chopped hazelnuts. It can be roasted, grilled, or sauteed, and it pairs nicely with balsamic vinegar for those preparations. You can mix it into whole wheat pasta or barley risotto for a little extra veggies. And if you're eating eggs, asparagus and eggs is a very tasty pairing. I enjoyed it for breakfast this morning. You can throw it into omelets or put a poached egg right on top of the leftover asparagus. Next slide. Next up, berries. Look at these beauties. Yummy. You will start to see blackberries, boysenberries, and raspberries in June, and the growing season goes through the summer. Strawberry season is a little bit longer for you guys. And while you could certainly just rinse them and pop them in your mouth and they would be delicious, you could also mix it up a little bit this summer. Strawberries actually also pair very nicely with balsamic vinegar. And you could try just taking some halved strawberries, toss it with some balsamic vinegar, maybe a touch of maple syrup. You roast that in the oven. It makes a really nice topping for yogurt or maybe on a piece of whole grain bread with some almond butter, sort of like a fancy peanut butter and jelly. You can also do a quick berry compote with any mix of berries. And this is something that I like to do when there's just a few sad berries left in the bottom of the container and they're starting to look like they're going south. And throw them in a pan with just a little bit of water to get them started, maybe some flavorings like a cinnamon stick, lemon, or orange peel. Simmer that up a bit, really delicious, and save those berries from the garbage. For a cold treat, you could consider a frozen yogurt bar. Here you would puree some berries, mix it with some Greek yogurt, almost like you're going to make a smoothie, but then you're going to spread it into the bottom of a baking pan, top it with some more fresh berries, and put it in the freezer. And then you have a nice cold sweet treat. Next slide. Next, stone fruit, another fruit that is typically only found in the warmer months, late spring through the summer. That includes peaches, plums, nectarines, and apricots. Stone fruit are great sources of fiber and antioxidants, as well as vitamins A and C, and those are nutrients that are important for your immune system. I know that's something we are all thinking about lately. And again, a bite of a fresh, juicy peach is a truly beautiful thing, but if you want to try something a little bit different, you could have a peach or nectarine, grill or roast it, and then dress it up a little bit with maybe a drizzle of honey, a dollop of Greek yogurt, some chopped pistachios. As I think about this, maybe a sprinkle of cardamom would be tasty on there. You could also make a quick summertime kale salad. I have been known to eat this for lunch or for breakfast. Mix some thinly sliced kale with a chopped peach or nectarine, some chopped almonds, dress with some lemon juice and olive oil, and just give that a sprinkle of sea salt. You're good to go. Finally, you could also do a savory application. You can make a spiced apricot chutney, and that would pair really nicely with a piece of grilled chicken or fish that was made with a Moroccan spice rub. Next slide. For our final seasonal vegetable, I wanted to talk about corn. Corn is also something that's harvested in the warmer months. And I wanted to talk about corn because I think it's gotten a bad rap for being a starchy vegetable. So let's talk about it. Can starchy vegetables be part of a heart-healthy diet? In my opinion, emphatically yes. Because we have to remember that a minimally processed carbohydrate, like this beautiful ear of corn right here, is not going to act the same in your body as white rice or white bread or white pasta. You just have to remember that it's your carbohydrate, balance your plate, and you're good to go. Corn contains fiber and magnesium, two nutrients that we know are great for heart health. It can also be eaten raw or cooked when it's nice and fresh. You could actually grill or roast it right in the husk for a really quick and easy side dish in the summer, because once it's cooked, that husk is going to peel right off and all those little silks. You don't have to fight with it so much. Next slide. I wanted to close with one of my family's favorite summer recipes, which is a corn, tomato, and cucumber salad. It really tastes of the season. So if you've got some nice fresh corn, you just slice the kernels off raw, mix them with some cubed cucumbers and heirloom tomatoes. And you really want those nice juicy heirloom tomatoes for this, because they're going to release all those juices and it's going to become part of the dressing. You can toss all of that with a good tasting olive oil, some red wine vinegar, a squeeze of lemon juice, a little salt and pepper. It is really delicious. It gives you a nice balance of the starchy vegetable from the corn with the non-starchy vegetables from the cucumbers and tomatoes. It's two side dishes in one. You know, so often people will express to me concern about starting a heart-healthy diet because they love food. Well, I hope I've given you a few ways that you can get started on your heart health goals this summer without sacrificing your enjoyment of food. Kaylee, you can advance to the end. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Appreciate your insight and all those recipe ideas. That was great. Next up, we have Jacqueline Galis-Kirshen, who is a registered dietitian and nutritionist specializing in mindful eating and sustainable weight loss. She's the founder of the virtual nutrition private practice, Eat Right for Life, and provides private one-on-one small group nutrition coaching. Having been through her own personal weight loss journey, Jackie truly connects with her clients as she's walked in their shoes. She was born and raised in San Diego and is a first-generation American, being the daughter of Dr. Franklin and Jean Galis, and she lives in Carmel Valley right now.
Hi, my name is Jackie Kirshen, again, more so known as the daughter of Dr. Franklin and Jean Galis, as many of you may know me, and I am a registered dietitian and nutritionist and specialize in mindful eating and sustainable weight loss. So thank you, Melissa, for giving us such a great introduction of what a heart-healthy diet is and how we can implement seasonal foods and balance. And what I want to focus on today with you all is talking about mindful eating for sustainable weight loss. So I know the pandemic has probably been a little tough for people, and it's something that we've been more sedentary or eating a little bit more than we would have liked. So I definitely want to talk about how a healthy weight can prevent cardiovascular disease. Next slide. So a little bit about me, for those of you that know me from growing up, I was always cute, chubby little Jackie, and it was something that I didn't understand growing up what foods I was putting into my body. Even though I was active and definitely had a great life, I didn't realize that my food choices could affect me later in life. So the girl you see on the left, super happy, very vibrant, vivacious. However, I was diagnosed with prediabetes, and my doctor called me when I came home after my first semester of Emory and asked me how many alcoholic drinks I had a night. And I thought he was crazy because I didn't know what he was talking about. And that's when I realized that I had non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And that is when the severity of disease in that scare really got me thinking about, wow, I am 20 years old and I need to do something about my health. So that is when I started working with a nutritionist, and it took me about a year to a year and a half to lose 65 pounds. And I'm very proud to say from 2010 to 11, I've kept it off for the last 10 years. And that's how I became a registered dietitian and someone who specializes in mindful eating for sustainable weight loss. Next slide. So I wanted to talk about why being at a healthy weight can help prevent cardiovascular disease. So I'm sure that many of you know, especially if you're dealing with back issues or just a different health problems, that weight is usually a big indicator and reason why these diseases are more prevalent. So especially when it comes to cardiovascular disease, every unit of increase in your BMI can increase your risk of heart disease 5 to 7%. That may sound like a small number, but think about that 5 pounds comes on here and there. And I've had a lot of people coming to me during the pandemic saying they've gained 20, 30, even 40 pounds. So it's something to think about. How can I control my health and prevent, as Dr. Goodman was saying, and having a healthy weight is something that can help prevent any of these diseases. As you see, heart disease, diabetes, liver, kidney disease, some cancers, depression, osteoarthritis. These things are affected by our weight. And more importantly, as Melissa touched on, our nutrition, our diet. So those diets that are higher in saturated fat, trans fat, salt, white refined carbohydrates, those not only increase our risk of LDLs, which again, the bad cholesterol, creating fatty deposits leading to heart disease, but also it means that there's higher calories, therefore leading to weight gain. And it's just this domino trickle effect. Next slide. So again, what I specialize in mindful eating for sustainable weight loss. So for those of you that don't know what mindful eating is, I want to help just give you the basis. So mindful eating is about making conscious decisions. And when Dr. Goodman and I were talking about how to incorporate weight loss, and the biggest thing that people have trouble with, because you can do any fad diet that you want and lose weight really quickly, but it's not something that's sustainable. So what is something that is sustainable? Mindful eating is making conscious decisions. So the first thing that I teach my clients and my patients, the 5 S's of mindful eating. So if you leave with anything from this presentation, I hope that you remember some of these concepts of mindful eating. Sitting down, slowly chewing, savoring the food, simplifying, smiling. Just from some of those behaviors can help keep you motivated and help you make more mindful choices. Also, making sure that your meals are balanced. So the way that I approach nutrition and balance is with 3 main components. I want to enhance and increase what you have in your diet instead of taking things away. More protein, lean protein, as Melissa said, coming from plant-based sources, higher fiber, and healthy fats. So again, thinking about your meals and start to ask yourself, is my breakfast balanced? Is it just simple carbohydrates, or do I have protein, fiber, and healthy fat? Planning your meals and snacks is another great way. I'm a dietitian and I have not meal planned or meal prepped a day in my life. So I don't want you to feel like you have to meal prep, but definitely having a plan where we're going to eat out for Taco Tuesday, or I know that I want to make salmon on this night, especially when it comes to snacks. That's where people are just going into the pantry or eating whatever is left over from their kids. Having a plan, bringing these things to work with you can help you maintain your weight, make healthy choices, and also not leave you in a situation where I don't know what to eat. So whatever, I'm just going to eat whatever's here. Setting SMART goals. So I'm sure you've heard of what a SMART goal: specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, time sensitive. So super important that you're also making sure that you're not saying, I'm going to lose 65 pounds in 2 months. So again, I hope that I've helped you at least see that weight loss can be sustainable, but you want those small incremental goals. Enjoying your favorite foods in moderation. That's something super important as well. When you deprive yourself, and think about with your children, you say, don't do that. What do? They come back with a vengeance and do it even more. So definitely allow yourself to enjoy a portion of the Ben & Jerry's ice cream, or half of the burger, or healthify it. So that's what I mean by maybe instead of having 2 sides of the bun or having mayo and all the fixings, how can you make it better by having it open-faced or no mayo and having avocado instead? So many different ways that you can practice these mindful eating for sustainable weight loss. The last 2, super important, focusing on your feelings and non-scale victories. The scale can fluctuate. So focus on, how is my exercise? How is my sleep? How am I feeling in my clothes? Lastly, being patient and consistency will pay off. Slow and steady wins the race. Next slide. So It's super important when it comes to mindful eating. I always like to encourage my patients and clients to focus on their hunger and fullness cues. That's when the hunger scale comes in. So again, mindful eating is super conscious. So I'm sure many of you have been on the side where you're the 1-2 and you're ravenous and you haven't eaten for many hours. And also the Thanksgiving, the 8, 9, 10 when we're super full. I encourage you to practice throughout this week and hopefully the rest of your life, staying in that neutral zone. I'm sure you feel better when you feel lighter and you feel content and satisfied. Studies have shown that those that actually practice mindful eating are able to lose, whether it's 9 pounds in 3 months or in beyond 26 pounds. So it really is powerful because when you're staying in that middle 5 to 6 range, you are eating less calories, therefore leading to weight loss. Next slide. So I personally want to show the power of mindful eating and the power of nutrition. So this is an example of one of my patients. He is a male and 35. And as you can see from his blood results, his blood lipids, he had super high cholesterol. He had very low HDL and very high LDL. He was active, but when he came to me, he was shocked and came and said, Jackie, I don't want to take a statin. I'm 35. I have 2 kids. I don't want to die from heart disease. What can I do? So I helped evaluate his diet, help him practice mindful eating. And next slide. Oh, I don't know what happened with the slide, but at least you can see the numbers that after 3 months of medical nutritional therapy intervention, I helped him bring down his total cholesterol from 237 all the way down to 190. That's an incredible drop in 3 months just from the power of nutrition and food. It even helped him raise his HDL up 3 points, and he kept the same amount of exercise. Again, the power of food. Lastly, we're still working on his LDL, but again, to bring it down 42 points from 183 to 141 is incredible. So I hope that shows you, next slide, that food is so powerful, and let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. That is something that I live by. It's something that I help my patients and clients with all of the time. So I want you to feel at least a little bit of hope that you are capable of making these changes just from evaluating your nutrition and your lifestyle instead of, as Dr. Goodman was talking about, always running to different medicines and supplements.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, and sorry about that little jump over there. Next up, we have Dr. Maurice Buchbinder. Dr. Buchbinder has worked as an interventional cardiologist for the last 30 years. In addition to interventional cases, he has been involved in multiple clinical trials, including angioplasty in the early 1980s, stents in the 1990s, and most recently with valve replacement procedures that do not require open heart surgery. He has helped with the development of several non-surgical valve devices, including a device called the Watchman. He is currently the principal investigator in an ongoing clinical trial for the treatment of severe drug-resistant high blood pressure. And Dr. Buchbinder is going to be joined by Tom Moore, the medical officer of Ablative Solutions. So Dr. Buchbinder and Tom, go ahead, take it away.
Pleasure meeting you today. Thank you very much for the SAJAC, and it's great to be there today to discuss about our new hypertensive disease regarding, most importantly, a renal denervation. Now we'd like to present with my friend Tom to discuss the intention of what are needed for this disease. Tom, can you present?
Thank you, Dr. Buchbinder. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Loud and clear? Perfect. Thank you. And I also want to congratulate the presenters ahead of me for the wonderful content and presentations leading up to this presentation. And Dr. Buchbinder and I would like to introduce you to a study that we're collaborating on. It's called the Target BP1 clinical study. And it's for patients that have drug-resistant hypertension. Before I talk to the study a little bit, we wanted to spend a little time talking about what is hypertension, what is high blood pressure. Could you advance the slide, please, Kaylee? Okay. So hypertension is also known as high or raised blood pressure, and it's a condition that's persistent. You know, some of us might get into an accident on our way to work, right? And because of that accident, we become anxious and stressed and our blood pressure goes up. But it goes down after if you're normotensive. When patients have hypertension, their blood pressure is consistently at a high level that could become a significant risk factor. And so each time the heart beats, it pumps blood into the vessels, and that blood pressure is created by the force of the blood pushing against the walls of the blood vessels. And the higher the pressure, the harder it is for the heart to pump. Right? And so the heart may get bigger over time, right? And other things may happen over time. But we'll talk about some of those risk factors. Next slide, please. So I think all of us on this call and part of this presentation know what our blood pressure it is. There's a reason that every time we see a medical professional, they take our blood pressure, right? And it's really consisting of two numbers. The first is the systolic number, which is the top number. And that's the pressure in the blood vessels when the heart contracts or beats. And the second number, or the diastolic number, represents the pressure in the vessels when the heart rests between the beats, right? And there's different levels of hypertension, you know, so I want to orient you to the orange bar in the screen. Right? And that is where the upper number is between 130 and 139, or the lower number is between 80 and 89, right? That's considered stage 1 hypertension. And patients that are fortunate to have blood pressure that's less than 120 over less than 80, that is considered normotensive. And that is really a target for physicians and healthcare professionals, is to see how many patients they can get in their practices to be normotensive. And as blood pressure goes up and we jump into the orange and red categories, the stage 2 hypertension, which is 140 or higher with the diastolic or the lower number 90 or higher, right? We really want to start taking action to lower that blood pressure and get that to a controlled number. And really blood pressure control, as defined by the American Heart Association, is anything less than 130 over 80. That would be blood pressure under control. And believe it or not, there's a lot of people out there that are walking around with blood pressures that are above 180, you know, and that's considered a hypertensive crisis, or above 120 diastolic. And that is really a danger zone. So what we want to do as medical professionals, you know, for all the patients that are out there, is to work with them to lower blood pressure to an acceptable level. Next slide, please. So some facts about hypertension. It's very prevalent. And these statistics are from the World Health Organization. And that's a great website to go to learn about cardiovascular health. But if you Google WHO and hypertension, you'll find a number of key interesting facts. But there's over 1 billion people worldwide that have hypertension, that have blood pressure above 130, you know, and as many as 1 in 4 men and 1 in 5 women, you know, had hypertension as of 2015. But only 76% of patients with hypertension actually receive treatment. And only 54% of patients are at control of blood pressure, you know, which in this slide is defined as 140 or lower, right? And the main cause of poor treatment results can be non-adherence to therapy. And I don't mean just medications, but they're not adherent to good diet. And we learned a lot about good practices, you know, for diet this evening, you know, wonderful presentations on how important that is. But they're not adherent to their exercise. You know, they're not adherent to taking supplements or doing the things that they should do that naturally can lower blood pressure. And it's estimated that despite best efforts, despite taking medications, that 12% of patients have treatment-resistant hypertension. That means no matter what physicians and healthcare professionals are providing to the patient, they can't control their blood pressure. And when left untreated, the damage that high blood pressure does to your circulatory system is a significant contributing factor to cardiovascular disease, things like heart attacks, heart failure, stroke, kidney disease, and other health threats. Next slide, please. So additional facts about hypertension. If you have blood pressure that in this case with this slide is 175/105, you are 8 times more likely to have a cardiovascular death from myocardial infarction, heart failure, kidney disease, and stroke. That's why that is called a hypertensive crisis, right? And if your blood pressure is, say, 160, you're 4 times more likely. 135, 2 times. And if we can get you to under control, you're at baseline without any additional risk for cardiovascular mortality related to blood pressure. So it's really important for you to try to take control and take action to reduce your blood pressure. And now we'll talk a little bit about, a few methods, whereby you can take action to lower your blood pressure. Next slide, please. So as we learned earlier, from the great presentations, eating a well-balanced diet that's low in salt, right? Limiting alcohol content or consumption, enjoying regular physical activity, managing your stress, maintaining a healthy weight. If you're smoking, please quit smoking, right? If you're prescribed medications, take those medications. There's a reason your physician prescribed them. And really put together a plan with your treating physician, right, to take control of that blood pressure. Next slide, please. So as things progress, physicians will begin prescribing medications to include diuretics, which is referred to as the water pill, or an ACE inhibitor, or an ARB, a beta blocker, a calcium channel blocker. Those are really the main medications physicians will use to try to get your blood pressure to a normotensive level. But despite these approaches, right, there still is a number of patients that have high blood pressure, and that is the patient population Dr. Bookbinder and I wanted to talk to you about tonight. Okay, next slide, please. So for those individuals that despite best efforts aren't able to get their blood pressure below 150 systolic, and their diastolic below 90, those types of patients may qualify for clinical research that we're collaborating on with Dr. Bookbinder and his faculty at Sharp Medical Center. And the study is looking at a therapy called renal denervation, and specifically alcohol-mediated renal denervation. And the target of the procedure is the nerves that run from the kidney along the renal artery to the kidney, right? And then communicate in transit through the circulatory system, to the brain. And those nerves can actually transmit signals that help control blood pressure. But overactive signaling by those nerves can actually contribute to raising your blood pressure. And so the study, the Target BP1 study, is evaluating the catheter-based procedures. So this is done in a catheterization lab by an interventional cardiologist. In our case, this is Dr. Bookbinder and his team at Sharp. And the therapy is designed to deactivate those overactive nerves with a targeted infusion of dehydrated alcohol. So it's a catheter-based treatment that delivers alcohol to the nerves. And by deadening those nerves, we're reducing the overactive signal to the kidney that can cause high blood pressure. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit of an animation that describes the procedure and where we're targeting. So on the left picture where you see the 2 kidneys, you'll see arrows pointing to the arteries that feed the kidney. Those are called the renal arteries, the left and right renal artery. And along those arteries on the right side, you can kind of see a caption where you see those orange nerves that are running along the artery. And what this device does, it's a catheter-based treatment. So there's a small incision in your groin. Dr. Bookbinder would take the catheter up to the renal artery. We would find the correct location using fluoroscopy, and we would deploy 3 needles, microneedles, that would go into the perivascular space, and that's the space just outside the artery, and deliver 0.6 mLs of dehydrated alcohol to those nerves. And once the treatment is done, it only takes about 60 seconds per treatment. The needles are retracted, the tubes are retracted, the catheter is retracted. And we would be treating both main renal arteries, so at least 2 treatments per patient, and potentially an accessory artery as well. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit about what the catheter looks like. On the left, you can see the catheter with those 3 tubes that extend out. And in the center, you can see the 3 microneedles are deployed, and you can see the droplets of alcohol going through those microneedles. And on the right side, that's the piece that Dr. Bookbinder likes. That's the handle that he would work with to deploy the catheter and those microneedles. So we are currently conducting the study. We're fairly early on in the study. It's a global study to include centers in Europe and the US. About 100 centers will be participating. And we will be randomizing up to 300 patients who would be eligible for the study, and the treatment moving forward. If you have any questions about the therapy, if I could just give you a quick internet address, it's www.targetbp1.com. And that will provide you some additional information, but it'll also allow you to be introduced to the investigators at Sharp for consideration for the study.
Thank you so much, Tom and Dr. Bookbinder.
Thank you so very much. It was an excellent presentation, Tom.
Yes. What we can do is put that link in the chat if you'd like, Tom.
Please do so, yeah.
For
I
everyone.
will do that right now. Yep.
And go from there. Again, thank you to all of our panelists. I want to move on to the question and answer portion, which Dr. Goodman is going to be in charge of.
Firstly, just let me thank everybody. I mean, I thought the presentations were amazing. I won't talk about my own, but the rest of you were amazing. There's so much information to provide. I mean, I know myself, I didn't get through a lot of it, but the idea today was to get people interested, excited, and motivated. And I think Tom made a really important point that you have to have a discussion with your doctor about any of these things that we've brought up today. You want to be in a situation where you are discussing your own personal situation with your physician. I try to show you what risk factors people have. And I hope I made the point that there are lots of risk factors that contribute to having heart disease. But we have the technology today to know whether or not you actually have a plaque, whether you actually have heart disease, so that you don't have to guess about whether or not something, whether you've got a high-risk situation. You actually can know whether you've got plaque. And when you do, you want to be very aggressive. And that's what we talk about when we talk about lowering cholesterol with a statin or other ways that we lower cholesterol. Hypertension is another good example. Hypertension is a significant risk factor. You don't want to walk around with severe hypertension. And I think that the advantage today of having Dr. Bookbinder and Tom is to show you that we have technologies today where you can really lower significantly these risk factors. So I want to thank the panel. The nutritionists were amazing. Melissa and Jackie, awesome. I mean, I was so hungry and I wanted to eat good food. And that's why I was really amazing. I'm really grateful to you. And of course, Dr. Gordon, thank you so much. So let me take some of the questions. Dr. Bookbinder or Tom, I know there have been other studies related to treating renal artery and doing denervation or using ablation. There was Simplicity, there's been a Radiance trial, there's a Spiral trial. Could you just make a comment about why you think that, that Simplicity trial failed and what you think the advantages of using alcohol ablation?
Yeah, I can discuss that too, but maybe Tom, you can start. This is really the disease that we are interested with because we are better than others. And this is what we have to start with. Tom, maybe you could discuss a little different between them and us. What's the difference?
Sure. And sorry, Tom, I don't want to cut you off, but if you could try to make it short, because I've got so many questions, but if you could just say why you came to try a new technique, which could be amazing because it's such an important.
It is indeed the DV. Perfect.
Yeah. So there's three forms of renal denervation. There's radio frequency, there's ultrasound, and there's alcohol-mediated renal denervation. And obviously we need to prove out the efficacy and the safety, in this study. But potentially our therapy is unique in that it's one treatment per artery instead of multiple treatments per artery. So what we want to prove out is that the therapy is very quick, fairly painless, and because there's less fluoro, right, and less contrast used to verify the placement correctly of the catheter, it could be safer for the patient. So that's what we want to prove out.
Absolutely.
And what we learned from the early studies is patient selection is really important. We want to make sure that these patients are on medications, are taking their medications and stay on their medications so that when we introduce the therapy in the study with those medications, all things are constant. And I think that was one of the problems from the first renal denervation studies is they allowed the physicians to reduce medications, increase medications, change medications. And so for the study period of 3 months, these patients that are enrolled need to stay on those medications at those dosages and be adherent to the study protocol.
I think one of the other issues with radio frequency, people weren't really sure whether they were being effective. There wasn't immediate feedback.
That's correct.
And I think the alcohol gives you the advantage. The alcohol is going to get...
That's the difference is the alcohol.
Right? Yeah.
It's a huge difference.
Maurice, if you're still here in 10 minutes, I'm going to just ask you about what you think's happened in interventional cardiology in terms of latest stents and devices. But I just want to get to some other questions. Neil, I got a question for you about exercise. A lot of people are interested in, is the intensity of exercise important? And the AHA makes a recommendation of 150 minutes a week, but a lot of people don't do that. And they go, if I can't do that, I'm doing nothing. So give us a guideline on how intense does it have to be? And what would be a minimum amount that you should at least get started?
Dennis, that's an excellent question. Thank you very much. I'll try to give a brief answer. A lot depends on the reason why you're exercising, whether you're exercising for fitness or exercising for health. When it comes to fitness, exercise intensity is very important. We've conducted a number of studies in this area showing that the harder you exercise, the greater the increase in fitness. However, when it comes to exercising for health, it's the total volume of exercise that you perform that's important. And you can exercise at a low intensity and derive similar benefits to somebody exercising at a higher intensity. So it's a total amount of exercise that you do. As far as the minimum amount of exercise, there are studies showing that very small amounts of exercise are beneficial for sedentary individuals. Generally, we recommend trying to exercise for at least 10 minutes at a time, if that's possible. So if you're aiming to do, for example, 30 minutes of exercise 5 days a week and you can't do all 30, if you did 10 minutes 3 times during the day, you'd probably get similar benefits. Keep in mind also what I said during my presentation, that it's 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity exercise. So if you did, for example, 15 minutes of exercise 5 days a week, you'd be obtaining significant benefit from a health standpoint. Hopefully that helps clarify the question.
Yeah. Thank you. So, there's no minimum amount in terms of what you need. You should get started. And I think that I found with patients, once they get into it and they start to see the benefits, just the endorphin, the feeling that you're actually feeling better, it hooks you into it and you're much more likely to stay for it. Ladies, I've got a question about nutrition. I mean, it's probably the most written about, talked about thing in the whole world is how do you lose weight? and how can I lose weight to look better, feel better, and be healthier? Because obesity is a huge problem. I want to ask you about patients who get motivated, they lose weight, they're so happy, and then very quickly they gain the weight. Where are we making a mistake? Are we not sticking with the patient to continue motivating them? Why are they losing interest? Is it just too much hard work and you can't do it anymore? Because we've got to figure out, how do we help people to stay with it? You did it, Jackie, and you're so proud of yourself and you've become a nutritionist. But I'd like you and Melissa to just talk about some of the techniques that you have to keep people motivated and keep them with the program. I want to just say before you answer, Neil, I think that's what you're all about with Intervent. You have, and maybe you'll pipe in too, that you have ongoing communication with the patients and with the clients, because that's, I think, crucial. Jackie.
That is an excellent question. And it is definitely something that's super important as a trained bariatric dietitian as well. That's something that, again, I saw with some of my patients within their first year, again, losing weight, and then come 5-10 years down the road when it's, okay, the weight's coming back. So it's about making sure you have tools and no quick fixes. So the thing that I like to do with my patients is, what is a sustainable way and lifestyle? But when it comes to accountability, that is something that a lot of people, they're either buying a meal plan for the masses, they're in a group of 400 people and things like that. They don't have that individual support and accountability. That's where Melissa and I come in, having a dietitian, having someone on staff who is there to be that person who's accountable to your patients. Something that I do with a lot of my patients is when it comes to food journaling. That's something every single day that you can keep yourself accountable. You don't have to do it to the extreme where it's an amount and calories and this and that. I have my clients write what they feel. If they have an iPhone and things like that, they take a picture and then they talk about, this kept me full, this caused me GI issues, that every single day and every meal that they're making that conscious decision. So it's not like that they forget, that they're in the moment, and it keeps them accountable. So if you look at different studies, people eat breakfast or that they exercise, those are the people that keep the weight off, but also those that make consistent, healthy choices. And that happens when you are food journaling.
Thank you. Okay, Melissa, are you there?
I'm here. Hello.
Thank you for staying. Melissa, they're going to lock the building. So after you speak
I'm going to have to sleep here.
We're going to let you leave. But
okay,
maybe you can just weigh in about what you do, because you're in a university setting. We work together. You know, patients get approval from an insurance company for 10 sessions. And then what? You know, how do you stay with them? How do you keep them going?
Yeah, I think that there are kind of three main components as I've thought about this. How do we make a program sustainable? One, I think that Jackie really hit on, which is, was your initial plan one that was sustainable, or was it something that could only ever be temporary, like a meal subscription, like a very low carb diet or shakes or something like that, where then when it's over, you haven't really built the skills you needed to sustainably make healthful and mindful food choices. So I think that's thing number one. I think thing number two is to address not only food choice, but also any underlying behavioral issues that are present. We know ourselves, right? And many of us kind of know when we sit back and think about it, you know, well, if I'm eating a lot of snacks at night, why? What am I feeling at that time? Am I bored? Am I frustrated? Am I sad? And getting at those behaviors, I think, also helps. And then the third thing for me is to understand that there will be setbacks, right? Part of the stages of change, we expect some relapse. And then to kind of have the grace to acknowledge that it happened, forgive ourselves, not dwell on what went wrong, but to realize that it's okay. It was one day or 1 week or even 1 month, and to have the skills to get back to it. So while it would be lovely if insurance companies would provide never-ending support and allow us to meet with patients interminably, hopefully we can give them the skills to do that for themselves. Or maybe I've had some people kind of get off the wagon and then realize when they have to come back and come on back.
I think one of the most important things is that relationship, which is the same as a physician with these patients, any healthcare provider. If there's a good relationship, you and Jackie are so passionate that people want to come back and enjoy the conversation. And I think that's a crucial aspect. You're excited for your patients when they lose weight. and you stick with them and they feel happy to come and tell you because you make them feel good about their achievements. Neil, just in a sentence, maybe you can just say how Intervet's making a big difference by having, basically nutritionists around and life coaches on the team.
First of all, I think Melissa and Jackie gave excellent answers. And what we try to do is incorporate a lot of what they said into our interventions using a very formal, structured, systematic approach where we work one-on-one with individuals to formulate personalized goals, formulate an individualized action plan, help the individuals implement the action plan one step at a time, and provide ongoing support while making use of a lot of what's been learned about behavior change. So things like adult learning theory, social learning theory, the stages of change model, motivational interviewing, single concept learning, etc. But also, Dennis, what you said is extremely important, the ongoing intervention and accountability.
So at the end of this, which is going to be soon, we're going to put up, Kelly's going to put up our emails, and you can get in touch with any of us and Dr. Gordon, and maybe it'll be a way for you to get hooked into the system, because modifying these risk factors is absolutely crucial. Maurice, I'm going to let you go after this question. We've been around, we've worked together. I rate you as one of the best interventional cardiologists in the world, but not only that, you're a human being who's a brilliant physician. So my question to you is, how have you managed to stay a humanitarian while spending a lot of your life doing procedures, putting in devices, and having to do that, and at the same time trying to look at the big picture of what's best for the patient, when there's high motivation to do these procedures, both for yourself and because hospital systems would like to see you do them, because that's unfortunately where the remuneration is. I know it's a tough question, but why don't you just take a step?
First and foremost, I'd like to thank you very much for this indication. It was a great presentation. The ladies were excellent. I usually don't do that. I don't come and see that, but this was a great presentation. I've been here for 2 hours now, so I am impressed.
It's very unusual. I'm very
impressed. In general, it's been a very difficult life to start with in the 80s and the 90s. And now it developed so many esophagus, many patients. It has been very difficult. And we are starting to change a bit. We are not working as well as we had before. Many patients are working with other doctors. It's not really the same as it was before with us. It's different, but nevertheless, we are still working hard to find diseases and the patients to treat better and easier than we were before. So I think that life is changing a bit, but at the end of the day, it will come back in and we'll continue to grow.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom and Maurice. I'm gonna let you go because I know you had a time constraint. Same with you, Melissa. I'm going to stay for another 5-10 minutes because I want to take some of the questions related to supplements and risk factors. But thank you. It was really amazing.
Thank you very much as well. You were great. And you helped us a lot.
To have you on our panels.
Thank you. Good evening.
Thanks. Hilal, my friend, you asked me a question about bergamot. So this was a question from Hilal Katsev, who's an old friend. And he wanted to know about bergamot because I mentioned it tonight, and I think a lot of people don't even know about it. And what it is it's a citrus fruit that grows in southern Italy in a region called Calabria. What they found out is that people who live there and eat a lot of this fruit are actually living longer and they've got lower cholesterols. And so they discovered that there's something inside this fruit that actually lowers cholesterol. And basically it's polyphenols and flavonoids. And it's basically, quote, natural in the sense that it's not synthetically made. It's not a chemical that lowers cholesterol. Now, I find this very exciting because it's a way to bring down cholesterol without having to take a medication. And as I showed you in my talk, there can be significant improvements. I mean, I didn't myself see my cholesterol came down 60 points. It turns out that HDL will go up as well, about 40%, and triglycerides go up, go down, and LDL can come down about 36%. The dose is 500 milligrams twice a day. So it's 1,000 milligrams a day. And there are one or two companies that I trust that make it. I don't want to be an advertisement here. So Hilal, if you send me an email, I will tell you who I use. And anybody else can ask me. So you can get a really good product from these two companies. I want to make the point when you're talking about supplements, you must be sure that you're working with companies that are scientifically based and that they have very high quality. There's no point buying something that is cheap because it doesn't contain what you need. So that's my answer to you. Please let me emphasize again. Bergamot is not instead of a statin. If you need a statin for the reasons that I gave you, you're either in the secondary prevention group, which means you've had an event and now we're preventing another one, or you're a high-risk patient and your doctor's decided you need a statin, because why do you go on a statin? To bring your LDL down very low. We know that bringing LDL very low reduces cardiovascular risk significantly. Who needs it in the primary prevention group? That's people who haven't had an event. It's high-risk patients. And it comes down to weighing up how high is the risk. Certainly, if you've got familial hyperlipidemia with a bad family history, you're going to be on a statin. But I gave you my approach to it as a doctor who's doing this for years and years. I get a calcium scan, and I get a carotid scan, and I get an LPA, and I go, you know what? You've already got disease. There's nothing to talk about. You should be on a statin. Or you have no plaque at this time. I'm happy to try bergamot because I think we need to get your cholesterol down, but we can do it without putting you on a statin. And obviously each person different, and you have to discuss that with your doctor. I've got a question here about hypertension from Barry, who wants to know, how do you bring down your blood pressure? And I think that it's obviously a very, very important that you realize there's so many aspects to lowering blood pressure. And you heard about what happens when you've got really serious high blood pressure that's not responding to medication, that we have these technologies that Tom discussed. But in the first place, most hypertension responds to modification of risk factors. And so I want to tell you what I tell my patients in terms of high blood pressure. Number one, you've got to try to bring your weight down. If you're overweight, you're likely to be hypertensive. If you're taking too much salt, that can contribute to hypertension. So we try to tell patients stay on a low, less than 1.5 grams of sodium chloride a day. And if your pressure is really high, 1.2 grams. So you want to reduce your salt content. Not everybody's salt sensitive, but a lot of people are. Number two, you want to exercise. Exercise is a brilliant way to lower blood pressure. Really important. Next, stress management is huge. I want to give you my own personal story. I had to go see a neurologist because unfortunately I suffer from a lot of headaches the other day. I sat down. I tend to get anxious when they take my blood pressure, and my pressure was 150/84. So she says, oh, well, I'm afraid your blood pressure is up. And you know what would have happened if I was seeing my internist? They would have probably put me on a medication. And I said, hang on, can I take a minute just to breathe? And I did deep breathing for 30 seconds. I said, take it again. It was 130/82. I want you to know that stress is a major factor when it comes to hypertension. So stress management is a huge thing that you can do. Meditation, biofeedback, very important because you're increasing your parasympathetic nervous system. When your sympathetic nervous system is in overdrive, all sorts of bad things happen. And one of them is hypertension. So I'm sure all my panel here will agree with me. Yoga, meditation, biofeedback, listening to music, taking time for yourself, increases parasympathetic nervous system and lowers pulse rate and blood pressure. So before I end off, let me just say magnesium I have found to be very helpful as well. It's a natural way it's actually one of those, it's a supplement that actually causes vasodilatation. It works a lot like a calcium channel blocker. So I've had several patients who came with mild hypertension. I've put them on magnesium. I told you the dose is 3 milligrams per pound. And I've had them come back 6 weeks later and their pressure's in the normal range. Now, I never say take magnesium alone. I talk about the things I just discussed. But I'm a big believer that before you go on medication for mild hypertension, you try these lifestyle changes and you try magnesium. I got a question about the ceramides, which is a test. I just want to answer this because I'm trying to take all the questions. This is a blood test from the Mayo Clinic that's looking at whether or not we have other risk factors. So there's something called ceramides. These are they're lipids that are carried on LDL particles, and they promote infiltration of LDL into blood vessels. So Mayo Clinic's come up with a blood test where you can actually see if the ceramide levels are high. It's a little like it's like having a high HSCRP. It's like having a high plaque test or a high LPA. It increases your risk when you have these things in your system that increase risk. So it's another test. Right now, it's early days. I don't think it's out there in prime time with all the cardiologists because it's going to be another test, another expense. But it's very exciting because what we're trying to figure out the whole time is who is at significant risk, because those people need to be treated aggressively. I've tried today to tell you that patients come with multiple risk factors and there's a big question mark. What are we going to do? I always discuss the lifestyle changes: nutrition, exercise and flexibility, stress management, and sleep. But how do I decide if I'm going to be really aggressive with a statin? I do a calcium scan, a carotid scan, and I check an LPA. So that's a summary of my approach to it. It's been an absolute pleasure to help direct this and put it on. Pam, amazing. I commend you for bringing this to SAJAC. I was very blessed to have amazing speakers. Kaylee, amazing. You did a great job moderating this. Joel in the background. So thank you all. And please give us feedback. We would love to put another conference on. It probably won't be cardiovascular. Someone else will have another topic that they'd like to do. But tell us what you'd like us to do. We're all about educating SAJAC and our community to keep you well. And remember, I'm going to end off by saying, wellness is not the absence of disease. The only way you're going to be well is to take care of yourself. Going to the doctor who says, I can't find anything wrong with you, does not mean you're well. With that note, I'll say goodbye. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for attending. Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Goodman. Thank you, Jacqueline and Dr. Gordon, for staying until the very end here. As Dr. Goodman said, please respond. We will be sending out a survey within the next 24 hours, asking your opinion on today's discussion and any future discussions you might be interested in having. And last but not least, I will bring up a slide. Just a thanks once again to Jigsaw Health for sponsoring this event. Their website is there at the bottom, www.jigsawhealth.com. And for anyone interested in contacting any of our speakers today, I'll leave this slide up for just a few minutes. Other than that, thank you for joining us and see you at the next symposium.
Thank you, Kaylee.